24-year-old Rachel Martinez thought watching true crime documentaries would help her stay safe in the dangerous world around her, leaving her family proud of her newfound awareness and street smarts. But 3 years later, her mother finds her barricaded inside her apartment with security cameras pointed at every window, convinced that every neighbor is a potential killer and every delivery person is casing her home. But what happened next would expose the terrifying psychological trap that millions of true crime fans are walking into without even realizing it could destroy their mental health, relationships, and entire perception of reality. It was a quiet Tuesday evening in March of 2021 when Rachel Martinez first discovered the world of true crime documentaries. The 24-year-old marketing coordinator from Phoenix, Arizona, had just moved into her first apartment alone after years of sharing spaces with roommates. Like many young women living independently for the first time, Rachel felt a natural concern about her safety and wanted to educate herself about potential dangers. Rachel was not unusual in her demographic appeal to true crime content. According to research conducted by the Cleveland Clinic, women disproportionately consume true crime media, often viewing it as an educational tool to help them avoid becoming victims themselves. Dr. Chivona Childs, a psychologist specializing in the psychological effects of crime show consumption, explains that this appeal stems from a deep desire to understand how to protect oneself in dangerous situations. Rachel had always been a responsible, intelligent person. She graduated with honors from Arizona State University with a degree in communications and had built a successful career in digital marketing. Her friends described her as level-headed, analytical, and someone who approached problems with logic and careful consideration. She maintained close relationships with her family, particularly her mother, Carmen, and her younger brother, Diego. The initial appeal of true crime content seemed entirely reasonable to Rachel. She began with popular Netflix documentaries, drawn to cases that featured young women who had been victims of violent crimes. The content felt educational rather than purely entertaining. She would watch episodes while taking notes about safety tips, red flags in relationships, and warning signs that something might be wrong in various situations. Rachel found herself particularly drawn to cases that featured detailed psychological analysis of both perpetrators and victims. She appreciated documentaries that included expert commentary from forensic psychologists, criminologists, and law enforcement professionals. The scientific approach to understanding criminal behavior felt legitimate and educational rather than exploitative. What Rachel did not realize was that she was entering a psychological landscape that researchers have been studying with growing concern. The true crime genre has exploded in popularity over the past decade, becoming what Parrot Analytics identified between 2018 and 2021 as the fastest-growing segment of the streaming industry. This growth has coincided with increased awareness among mental health professionals about the potential psychological effects of consuming large amounts of crime-related content. The appeal of true crime content operates on multiple psychological levels. Scott Bonn, a professor of criminology at Drew University, explains that people receive a jolt of adrenaline as a reward for witnessing terrible deeds, creating a euphoric effect similar to that experienced on roller coasters or during natural disasters. This adrenaline response allows viewers to experience fear and excitement in a controlled environment, where the danger is thrilling but not actually threatening their physical safety. Rachel found herself drawn to this controlled fear experience. After long days at work dealing with client deadlines and marketing campaigns, settling down with a true crime documentary felt like the perfect way to unwind. The combination of intellectual stimulation from analyzing evidence and the adrenaline rush from dramatic revelations created what felt like an ideal form of entertainment. Beyond the adrenaline factor, true crime content appeals to fundamental human curiosity about the darker aspects of human nature. Forensic psychologist Dr. Paul Mattiusi notes that our fascination is driven by the many complexities found in motives for murder and other violent crimes. Human beings are naturally curious about evil and the justifications people use for committing terrible acts. For Rachel, this intellectual curiosity felt entirely healthy and normal. She enjoyed trying to piece together evidence before revelations were made in documentaries. She would pause episodes to discuss theories with friends or research additional details about cases online. This active engagement with the content made her feel like she was developing valuable analytical skills that could serve her well in both her professional and personal life. Rachel's consumption patterns during those first few months seemed completely reasonable. She would watch 1 or 2 documentaries per week, usually on weekend evenings or occasionally on weeknights when she had finished her work responsibilities. She maintained her regular social activities, continued exercising regularly, and kept up with her family relationships without any noticeable changes. The content itself seemed educational and valuable. Rachel learned about various investigative techniques used by law enforcement, gained insight into how different types of evidence are analyzed, and developed what she believed was a more sophisticated understanding of personal safety. She felt more confident walking alone at night, more aware of her surroundings in parking lots, and better equipped to identify potentially dangerous situations. Rachel's family initially supported her interest in true crime content. Her mother, Carmen, appreciated that Rachel was thinking seriously about her safety and taking steps to educate herself about potential dangers. Her brother Diego sometimes joined her for documentary viewing sessions when he visited her apartment, and they would discuss the cases together afterward. What none of them realized was that Rachel's brain was already beginning to adapt to the regular consumption of stress-inducing content. The human nervous system is designed to respond to perceived threats with heightened alertness and the release of stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. While these responses are beneficial in genuine emergency situations, prolonged exposure to content that triggers these responses can begin to alter baseline stress levels and overall psychological functioning. Rachel's initial experience with true crime documentaries felt entirely positive and beneficial. She believed she was gaining valuable knowledge that would help keep her safe, developing analytical skills that would serve her well professionally, and enjoying entertaining content that was more intellectually stimulating than typical television shows. She had no way of knowing that she was taking the first steps into what researchers now recognize as a potentially dangerous psychological trap. By the summer of 2021, Rachel's true crime consumption had quietly but significantly increased. What began as 1 or 2 documentaries per week had evolved into daily viewing sessions. She found herself subscribing to multiple true crime podcasts, joining online discussion forums, and spending increasing amounts of time researching cases that particularly captured her interest. The transition happened so gradually that Rachel barely noticed the changes in her viewing habits. She justified the increased consumption by telling herself that she was simply becoming more educated about important safety issues. When friends commented on how much she seemed to know about various criminal cases, Rachel felt proud of her expertise rather than concerned about the time she was investing in the content. However, the psychological effects of her increased true crime consumption were beginning to manifest in subtle but significant ways. Rachel started experiencing what psychologists recognize as hypervigilance, a state of heightened alertness to potential threats in the environment. She found herself more aware of suspicious behavior in public spaces, more careful about locking doors and windows, and more concerned about the people around her. According to research published by the Cleveland Clinic, consuming large amounts of crime-related content can activate the sympathetic nervous system, the part of the nervous system responsible for fight-or-flight responses. Dr. Erica Rojas, a psychologist who has studied the effects of true crime consumption, explains that this activation produces heightened levels of stress hormones that are beneficial in moments of genuine danger, but problematic when triggered chronically over extended periods. Rachel began experiencing the early signs of this chronic stress response. She noticed that she was having more difficulty falling asleep at night, often lying awake thinking about details from documentaries she had watched earlier in the evening. She found herself checking locks multiple times before bed and feeling anxious about sounds she heard in her apartment building that she had never noticed before. The content Rachel was consuming was also becoming more intense and disturbing. She had moved beyond mainstream Netflix documentaries to more graphic podcasts and online content that included crime scene photos, detailed descriptions of violence, and extensive analysis of the most brutal aspects of various cases. This escalation happened naturally as she developed tolerance to less intense content and sought out material that would provide the same level of psychological stimulation. Rachel's social media feeds became increasingly dominated by true crime content. She followed numerous accounts dedicated to unsolved cases, joined Facebook groups focused on amateur investigation, and began participating in online discussions about ongoing criminal cases. The algorithms that govern social media platforms quickly identified her interests and began feeding her an endless stream of crime-related content throughout her day. The psychological impact of this constant exposure to disturbing content was beginning to affect Rachel's worldview in concerning ways. Research published in various psychological journals has demonstrated that people who actively consume crime news and true crime content report being more fearful of crime regardless of actual crime rates in their communities. Rachel was experiencing this phenomenon firsthand, though she had not yet recognized it as problematic. Rachel's perception of her neighborhood began to change significantly. She started noticing details about her neighbors that she interpreted as potentially suspicious. The man in the apartment next door who worked unusual hours became someone she viewed with concern rather than simple curiosity. The delivery drivers who came to her building seemed to be observing the security measures more carefully than necessary. Dog walkers in her area appeared to be using their pets as cover for surveillance activities. These changes in perception were not based on any actual changes in her environment or any real evidence of increased danger. Instead, they reflected the way that chronic exposure to crime content was altering her baseline level of anxiety and her interpretation of ambiguous situations. Rachel's brain was becoming conditioned to look for potential threats and to interpret neutral situations through the lens of possible danger. The psychological trap was deepening, though Rachel remained unaware of what was happening to her mental state. She attributed her increased vigilance to becoming more educated and safety-conscious rather than recognizing it as a concerning psychological change. When friends mentioned that she seemed more anxious or paranoid than usual, Rachel dismissed their concerns and explained that she was simply being appropriately cautious in a dangerous world. Rachel's sleep quality continued to deteriorate as her mind raced with thoughts about various criminal cases she had been following. She found herself thinking about unsolved murders during work meetings, analyzing the psychology of killers while grocery shopping, and looking for suspicious behavior in every social interaction. The boundary between consuming true crime content as entertainment and living in a state of constant concern about crime was beginning to blur. The most troubling aspect of this gradual descent was how normal it felt to Rachel. Each day brought only small increases in anxiety, small changes in behavior, and small shifts in worldview. None of these changes felt dramatic or concerning in isolation. The cumulative effect, however, was a significant alteration in her psychological functioning that was beginning to impact her quality of life in ways she had not yet fully recognized. Dr. Chavona Childs warns that the psychological effects of excessive true crime consumption can be particularly insidious because they develop gradually and can feel like increased awareness rather than problematic anxiety. Rachel was experiencing exactly this phenomenon, interpreting her growing fears and hypervigilance as evidence that she was becoming more street-smart and safety-conscious rather than recognizing these changes as symptoms of a developing psychological problem. The true crime content that had initially felt educational and empowering was beginning to create the exact opposite effect. Rather than making Rachel feel safer and more prepared to handle dangerous situations, it was making her feel more vulnerable and more afraid of the world around her. The psychological trap was tightening its grip, and Rachel was still several months away from recognizing the serious nature of what was happening to her mental health. The autumn of 2021 marked a critical turning point in Rachel's relationship with true crime content. What had begun as casual educational viewing had evolved into an all-consuming obsession that was beginning to interfere with her work performance, social relationships, and overall psychological well-being. The psychological trap that had been developing gradually over the previous months was now becoming clearly apparent to everyone around Rachel, except Rachel herself. Rachel's daily routine had become entirely structured around consuming and analyzing true crime content. She would wake up each morning and immediately check multiple podcasts for new episodes, browse true crime forums for updates on cases she was following, and scan social media for any breaking news about ongoing investigations. This morning ritual often consumed an hour or more before she even began getting ready for work. During her commute to the office, Rachel would listen to true crime podcasts instead of music or news. She found that starting her day with detailed descriptions of violent crimes and analysis of criminal psychology set a tone of hypervigilance that she had convinced herself was beneficial for staying alert and safe throughout the day. However, this daily immersion in disturbing content was actually programming her nervous system to remain in a state of chronic stress and anxiety. Rachel's work performance began to suffer as her attention became increasingly divided between her professional responsibilities and her true crime interests. She would spend portions of her workday researching details about cases she had heard about in podcasts, participating in online discussions about unsolved murders, and reading news articles about ongoing investigations. Her productivity declined, and her colleagues noticed that she seemed distracted and anxious during meetings and collaborative projects. The most concerning development was Rachel's entry into the world of amateur online investigation. She had joined several forums where members attempted to solve cold cases and analyze ongoing investigations using publicly available information. Rachel found this collaborative detective work intensely engaging and began spending several hours each evening participating in these online communities. The phenomenon of amateur online investigation has become increasingly common as true crime content has grown in popularity. However, research has shown that these activities can become psychologically addictive and can lead to serious real-world consequences. The case of the 2013 Boston Marathon bombing provides a stark example of how amateur online investigators can cause significant harm through false accusations and misidentification of suspects. Following the Boston Marathon bombing, users on the social media platform Reddit attempted to identify the perpetrators by analyzing photographs and videos from the scene. These amateur investigators falsely identified an innocent man as a bombing suspect, leading to widespread harassment and distress for his family. The incident demonstrated how the combination of true crime obsession and online collaboration can lead to vigilante behavior with serious consequences for innocent people. Rachel was beginning to exhibit similar patterns of behavior in her own amateur investigation activities. She became convinced that she could identify inconsistencies in witness statements, spot overlooked evidence in crime scene photos, and develop theories about unsolved cases that professional investigators had missed. This belief in her own investigative abilities was reinforced by the echo chamber effect of online true crime communities, where members encouraged each other's theories and validated each other's suspicions. Rachel's involvement in these online communities was consuming increasing amounts of her time and emotional energy. She would spend entire weekends researching background information about suspects in various cases, analyzing social media profiles of people connected to investigations, and developing elaborate theories about criminal motives and methods. She maintained detailed notes about multiple cases and had created what amounted to a personal crime database on her computer. The psychological effects of this intense involvement in criminal cases were becoming increasingly apparent in Rachel's daily life. She had developed what psychologists call paranoid ideation, a tendency to interpret neutral events as potentially threatening or suspicious. Rachel began to view casual interactions with strangers as potentially dangerous, to interpret innocent coincidences as evidence of surveillance or stalking, and to assume malicious intent in situations that had perfectly innocent explanations. Rachel's relationships with friends and family members began to deteriorate as her conversation topics became increasingly dominated by details about violent crimes and her theories about various cases. She would bring up gruesome details from murder cases during social gatherings, analyze the psychology of killers during casual conversations, and express paranoid concerns about the safety of routine activities like going to shopping malls or restaurants. Her family members became particularly concerned when Rachel began making accusations about people in her personal life based on behavior she interpreted as suspicious. She became convinced that a neighbor in her apartment building was monitoring her comings and goings because she occasionally saw him in the lobby when she was leaving or returning home. She developed elaborate theories about the motives behind his supposed surveillance and spent considerable time researching his background online. Rachel's mother, Carmen, attempted to address her concerns about Rachel's behavior during a family dinner in November of 2021. Carmen pointed out that Rachel seemed constantly anxious, that she was talking obsessively about violent crimes, and that she appeared to be losing touch with reality in some of her interpretations of everyday events. Rachel responded defensively, arguing that she had simply become more aware of the dangers that exist in the world and that her family was naive about the prevalence of violent crime. The conversation with her family marked a crucial moment in Rachel's descent into the psychological trap of true crime obsession. Rather than recognizing the validity of her family's concerns, Rachel interpreted their worry as evidence that they did not understand the serious nature of the threats that surrounded them. She began to feel isolated from people who had previously been important sources of support and comfort in her life. Rachel's sleep continued to deteriorate as her mind raced with thoughts about various criminal cases and her growing list of suspicious behaviors she had observed in her daily life. She would lie awake at night, planning how to gather more information about people she suspected of malicious intent, developing strategies for protecting herself from perceived threats, and analyzing details from crime cases she was following online. The psychological trap had reached a critical stage where Rachel's consumption of true crime content was no longer providing the educational benefits or entertainment value that had originally attracted her to the genre. Instead, the content was feeding her growing paranoia and anxiety while isolating her from the people and activities that had previously brought joy and stability to her life. Rachel was approaching the point where her true crime obsession would lead to serious real-world consequences that would force her to confront the psychological damage that had been accumulating over the previous months. However, she remained convinced that her behavior was rational and appropriate, rather than recognizing it as a concerning departure from healthy psychological functioning. The winter of 2021 through 2022 revealed the full extent of the psychological trap that Rachel had fallen into through her obsessive consumption of true crime content. What researchers now understand about the neurological and psychological effects of chronic exposure to crime-related media was playing out in Rachel's life in increasingly dramatic and concerning ways. Dr. Jessica McCono, a forensic psychology professor at Regis University and co-host of the podcast Psychology After Dark, explains that constant exposure to true crime content can activate the sympathetic nervous system in ways that are helpful during genuine crises but harmful when sustained over extended periods. Rachel was experiencing the full range of negative effects that can result from this chronic activation of stress response systems. The neurological changes occurring in Rachel's brain were significant and measurable. Prolonged exposure to stress-inducing content had altered her baseline levels of cortisol and adrenaline, creating a state of chronic hyperarousal that made it difficult for her nervous system to return to normal resting states. This biological alteration was affecting her sleep quality, immune system function, concentration abilities, and emotional regulation. Rachel's worldview had become fundamentally distorted by her consumption of true crime content. Research published by multiple psychological organizations has demonstrated that people who consume large amounts of crime-related media develop significantly inflated perceptions of crime rates and personal danger. Rachel had become convinced that violent crime was far more common than statistical reality, that most people harbored dangerous secrets, and that she was constantly at risk of becoming a victim herself. This distorted perception of reality is what psychologists call the cultivation effect, a phenomenon where heavy consumption of media content shapes viewers' beliefs about the real world. Rachel's daily immersion in detailed accounts of murders, kidnappings, and violent assaults had cultivated a worldview where such events seemed normal and commonplace rather than statistically rare occurrences. The psychological trap was further deepened by what researchers identify as confirmation bias in true crime consumption. Rachel had become highly attuned to any information that confirmed her fears about potential dangers, while dismissing or ignoring evidence that contradicted her paranoid interpretations of events. When she read about a crime occurring anywhere in her city, it reinforced her belief that danger was everywhere. When weeks passed without any criminal incidents in her neighborhood, she interpreted this as evidence that she was successfully avoiding threats through her heightened vigilance. Rachel's involvement in online true crime communities was contributing to what psychologists call groupthink, a phenomenon where groups of like-minded individuals reinforce each other's beliefs and behaviors without critical evaluation. The forums and social media groups Rachel participated in were echo chambers, where members encouraged each other's paranoid theories, validated each other's suspicions about innocent people, and competed to develop the most elaborate explanations for criminal behavior. The addictive nature of true crime content was becoming clearly apparent in Rachel's behavior patterns. She experienced withdrawal-like symptoms when she attempted to reduce her consumption, felt compelled to check for updates on cases multiple times throughout the day, and found that she needed increasingly disturbing content to achieve the same level of psychological stimulation. These patterns mirror those seen in other forms of behavioral addiction and indicate that Rachel's brain chemistry had been altered by her consumption habits. Dr. Chavonna Childs from the Cleveland Clinic warns that excessive true crime consumption can lead to a condition she describes as crime paranoia, where individuals develop persistent fears about becoming victims of violent crimes despite living in relatively safe environments. Rachel was exhibiting all the classic symptoms of this condition, including hypervigilance, sleep disturbances, social withdrawal, and irrational fears about routine activities. The most troubling aspect of Rachel's psychological state was her complete loss of perspective about the statistical reality of violent crime. While true crime documentaries and podcasts focus exclusively on the most extreme and unusual criminal cases, Rachel had begun to view these extreme cases as representative of normal human behavior. She had lost the ability to distinguish between the sensationalized content designed for entertainment purposes and the actual prevalence of various types of criminal activity. Rachel's brain had essentially been rewired by months of exposure to stress-inducing content. The neural pathways associated with threat detection had become hyperactive, while those associated with feelings of safety and security had been suppressed. This neurological reorganization was creating a state of chronic anxiety that was exhausting her mental and physical resources, while making it increasingly difficult for her to function normally in daily life. The exploitation aspect of true crime content was also becoming apparent in Rachel's case. Much of the content she consumed treated real victims of violent crimes as entertainment commodities, focusing on gruesome details of their deaths while paying minimal attention to their lives, personalities, or the impact of their losses on family members. Rachel had become desensitized to this exploitation and was consuming content that treated human suffering as entertainment without recognizing the ethical problems with this approach. Research conducted by various academic institutions has identified what scholars call missing white woman syndrome, a pattern where true crime content disproportionately focuses on cases involving young, attractive white women, while ignoring cases involving victims from other demographic groups. Rachel's consumption habits reflected this bias, and her concerns about personal safety were shaped by media representations that did not accurately reflect the full spectrum of crime or the actual risk factors that different populations face. The psychological trap had become a self-reinforcing cycle, where Rachel's anxiety about crime drove her to consume more true crime content, which increased her anxiety levels and distorted her perception of reality, which led to even greater consumption of disturbing content. Breaking free from this cycle would require recognizing that her consumption habits were causing rather than solving her safety concerns. Rachel's case illustrates how true crime content can transform from seemingly educational entertainment into a genuine psychological threat. The same content that initially made her feel more informed and prepared had ultimately made her less capable of accurately assessing real risks and less able to enjoy normal activities without excessive fear and anxiety. February of 2022 brought the crisis that would finally force Rachel to confront the devastating impact of her true crime obsession. The psychological trap that had been tightening its grip over the previous year reached a breaking point that would expose the serious real-world consequences of her distorted thinking and compulsive behavior. The incident began when Rachel became convinced that her upstairs neighbor, David Torres, was planning to harm her. David was a quiet, 42-year-old accountant who worked from home and had lived in the building for 3 years without any incidents or complaints from other residents. However, Rachel had begun interpreting his normal daily activities as evidence of sinister intent. Rachel had noticed that David often walked past her apartment door when going to and from the building's laundry facility, mailboxes, and parking garage. She began timing these movements and concluded that he was deliberately monitoring her schedule to determine when she was home or away. When David's footsteps could be heard in his apartment above hers during evening hours, Rachel interpreted this as evidence that he was pacing while planning an attack. The situation escalated when Rachel discovered that David had recently purchased a set of kitchen knives online. She had seen the delivery box in the building's lobby and had photographed the shipping label to research what had been delivered. When she found the product listing for high-quality chef's knives, Rachel became convinced that David was preparing to commit a violent crime and that she was his intended target. Rachel's interpretation of these completely innocent circumstances was filtered through months of consuming true crime content that focused on cases where neighbors had committed violent crimes against each other. She had heard dozens of stories about killers who appeared normal to outside observers while secretly planning attacks on people who lived nearby. Her psychological state had deteriorated to the point where she could no longer distinguish between the extremely rare scenarios featured in true crime content and the normal activities of a law-abiding neighbor. Acting on her fears, Rachel began documenting what she believed was evidence of David's threatening behavior. She took photographs of him through her window, recorded timestamps of his movements throughout the building, and compiled a detailed dossier of his daily activities. She researched his background online, examined his social media profiles for signs of violent tendencies, and developed elaborate theories about his motives for targeting her. Rachel's behavior escalated to the point where she contacted local law enforcement to report her suspicions about David. She presented police officers with her collection of photographs, timeline documentation, and theories about his alleged plans to harm her. The responding officers quickly recognized that Rachel's concerns were based on paranoid interpretations of normal behavior rather than any actual evidence of criminal activity or threats. The police investigation revealed that David Torres had no criminal history, no connection to Rachel beyond living in the same building, and no knowledge that she even existed as an individual, rather than simply another anonymous neighbor. The kitchen knives she had interpreted as weapons were part of a cooking hobby David had developed during the pandemic. The walking patterns she had documented corresponded exactly to normal use of building facilities and parking areas. When police officers informed David that his neighbor had been documenting his activities and had accused him of planning violence against her, he was shocked and deeply disturbed. David had been unaware that Rachel was monitoring his behavior and had never had any interaction with her beyond occasional polite greetings in the building's hallways. The discovery that someone had been photographing him and researching his personal information made him feel violated and unsafe in his own home. The confrontation with law enforcement forced Rachel to face the possibility that her perceptions and conclusions might be fundamentally flawed. However, her psychological state had deteriorated to the point where she interpreted the police officer's dismissal of her concerns as evidence of incompetence or corruption, rather than as indication that her fears were unfounded. She became convinced that David had somehow convinced law enforcement that he was harmless despite the evidence she had compiled. Rachel's family learned about the incident when police officers contacted her emergency contact information to express concern about her mental state. Carmen Martinez received a phone call explaining that her daughter had made serious false accusations against an innocent neighbor and was exhibiting signs of paranoid thinking that suggested she needed immediate psychological evaluation and treatment. The news that Rachel had been secretly monitoring and photographing a neighbor, compiling detailed surveillance documentation, and making false accusations to law enforcement shocked her family members. They had observed Rachel becoming increasingly anxious and obsessed with crime-related topics, but they had not realized that her behavior had escalated to the point of stalking and harassment. Carmen and Diego immediately traveled to Phoenix to confront Rachel about what had happened and to insist that she seek professional help for what was clearly a serious psychological crisis. When they arrived at Rachel's apartment, they were horrified by what they discovered inside. Rachel had transformed her living space into what resembled a command center for criminal investigation. The walls were covered with printouts of crime scene photographs, timelines of various cases she had been following, maps marking locations of unsolved murders, and detailed notes about suspects in multiple investigations. She had installed additional security cameras, motion sensors, and door alarms throughout the apartment. The windows were covered with blackout curtains, and furniture had been arranged to create barriers and hiding spots. The apartment revealed the full extent of Rachel's psychological deterioration over the previous months. She had been living in a state of constant fear and hypervigilance that had transformed her home into a fortress designed to protect against threats that existed primarily in her imagination. The space felt more like the hideout of someone experiencing a complete break from reality than the home of a young professional woman. Rachel's response to her family's concern and the police intervention was to become defensive and angry, rather than to recognize that her behavior had become problematic. She argued that everyone around her was naive about the dangers that existed in the world, and that her vigilance and investigation activities were necessary for her survival. She maintained that David Torres was dangerous despite the complete lack of evidence supporting this belief. The breaking point had arrived. But Rachel was still trapped within the psychological distortions that had been created by her obsessive consumption of true crime content. The real-world consequences of her behavior, including legal liability for harassment and the distress caused to an innocent neighbor, had not yet penetrated her altered perception of reality. It would take professional intervention and significant effort to help her recognize the extent of the psychological damage that had occurred and begin the process of recovery. The intervention that would ultimately save Rachel from the psychological trap she had fallen into came through the combined efforts of her family, mental health professionals, and her own gradual recognition that something had gone seriously wrong with her thinking and behavior. The process of awakening to the reality of her situation and beginning recovery would prove to be lengthy and challenging, but it would ultimately restore her ability to live without the constant fear and paranoia that had consumed her life. Carmen Martinez used her influence as Rachel's mother to have her daughter undergo a mandatory psychological evaluation following the incident with David Torres. This evaluation was conducted by Dr. Patricia Vasquez, a clinical psychologist specializing in anxiety disorders and the psychological effects of media consumption. Dr. Vasquez had extensive experience treating patients whose mental health had been negatively impacted by excessive exposure to disturbing content. During the initial assessment, Dr. Vasquez quickly identified that Rachel was suffering from what psychologists classify as media-induced anxiety disorder, a condition where chronic consumption of stress-inducing content leads to persistent anxiety, paranoid thinking, and impaired reality testing. Rachel's symptoms included hypervigilance, sleep disturbances, social isolation, paranoid ideation, and compulsive behavior related to crime investigation activities. The first step in Rachel's treatment involved what Dr. Vasquez called a digital detox period, where Rachel was required to completely eliminate all true crime content from her daily routine. This meant no documentaries, podcasts, news articles, social media posts, or online forum discussions related to criminal cases. Rachel was also required to unsubscribe from all crime-related content, delete true crime applications from her devices, and ask family members to monitor her internet usage. Rachel initially resisted this complete elimination of true crime content, arguing that staying informed about criminal activity was necessary for her safety. She experienced withdrawal-like symptoms during the first week of the detox, including increased anxiety, difficulty concentrating, and a strong compulsive urge to seek out crime-related information. These symptoms demonstrated the addictive nature of her consumption patterns and the extent to which her brain chemistry had been altered by chronic exposure to disturbing content. Dr. Vasquez explained to Rachel how true crime content had affected her neurological functioning and psychological state. She helped Rachel understand that the constant activation of stress response systems had created a state of chronic hyperarousal that was exhausting her mental and physical resources while distorting her perception of reality. The educational process helped Rachel begin to recognize that her fears and suspicions were symptoms of a psychological condition rather than accurate assessments of real dangers. The recovery process included cognitive behavioral therapy techniques designed to help Rachel challenge and modify the distorted thought patterns that had developed during her period of true crime obsession. Dr. Vasquez worked with Rachel to identify situations where she was interpreting neutral events as threatening, to develop more accurate risk assessment abilities, and to rebuild her capacity for normal social interaction without excessive suspicion or fear. One of the most important aspects of Rachel's recovery was learning to distinguish between genuine safety awareness and paranoid thinking. Dr. Vasquez taught Rachel evidence-based strategies for personal safety that were grounded in statistical reality rather than the sensationalized scenarios featured in true crime content. Rachel learned that most violent crimes are committed by people known to the victim rather than by strangers, that random violent crime is statistically rare, and that the extreme cases featured in true crime documentaries represent only a tiny fraction of all criminal activity. Rachel also participated in group therapy sessions with other individuals who had experienced similar problems with media consumption and anxiety disorders. These group sessions helped her realize that she was not alone in having developed psychological problems related to excessive exposure to disturbing content. Hearing other people's stories helped normalize her experience while providing practical strategies for maintaining recovery. The process of making amends for the harm she had caused to David Torres was an important component of Rachel's recovery. With guidance from Dr. Vasquez, Rachel wrote a detailed apology letter acknowledging that her accusations and surveillance activities had been based on paranoid thinking rather than any actual evidence of threatening behavior. She also agreed to cover the costs of David's temporary relocation to another apartment while he processed the trauma of being falsely accused and secretly monitored. Rachel's family played a crucial role in supporting her recovery by helping her rebuild normal social relationships and daily routines that did not revolve around crime-related content. Carmen and Diego spent several weeks in Phoenix helping Rachel reorganize her living space, remove crime-related materials, and establish healthy boundaries around media consumption. They helped her reconnect with friends she had alienated during her period of obsessive behavior and encouraged her to pursue interests and activities that brought joy rather than anxiety. The recovery process also included education about the exploitative nature of much true crime content and the ethical problems associated with treating real victims of violent crimes as entertainment commodities. Rachel learned about the psychological impact on victims' families when their tragedies are sensationalized for profit, and began to understand how her consumption habits had been contributing to this exploitation. Dr. Vasquez introduced Rachel to research about the true crime industry and its effects on public perception of crime and safety. Rachel learned about missing white woman syndrome and other biases in crime reporting that create distorted impressions of who is most at risk for various types of victimization. This education helped her develop a more nuanced and accurate understanding of crime statistics and risk factors. 6 months into her recovery, Rachel was able to recognize the full extent of the psychological damage that had been caused by her true crime obsession. She could see how her consumption habits had gradually eroded her ability to think clearly, maintain healthy relationships, and live without constant fear. The contrast between her psychological state during the height of her obsession and her improved functioning during recovery made clear how dramatically the content had affected her mental health. Rachel's recovery included developing new hobbies and interests that provided intellectual stimulation without triggering anxiety or paranoid thinking. She began taking cooking classes, joined a hiking group, and returned to reading fiction novels that she had enjoyed before becoming obsessed with true crime content. These activities helped fill the time that had previously been consumed by crime-related research and investigation. The awakening and recovery process taught Rachel valuable lessons about media literacy, the importance of maintaining balance in content consumption, and the need to critically evaluate the psychological effects of entertainment choices. She developed skills for recognizing when media consumption was beginning to negatively impact her mental health, and learned strategies for maintaining healthy boundaries around disturbing content. Rachel's journey from casual true crime viewer to obsessed amateur investigator, and back to psychological recovery, provides crucial insights into the broader implications of society's growing fascination with criminal content. Her experience illustrates how what appears to be harmless entertainment can gradually transform into a serious threat to mental health, relationships, and overall quality of life. The most important lesson from Rachel's case is the recognition that true crime content, despite its educational veneer, is primarily designed as entertainment that exploits real human suffering for profit. The production companies, streaming platforms, and media outlets that create and distribute this content are motivated by audience engagement and advertising revenue rather than genuine concern for public safety or education. The sensationalized presentation of extreme criminal cases creates distorted impressions of crime rates and risk factors that can lead to unnecessary fear and anxiety. Rachel's experience demonstrates how the psychological effects of true crime consumption can accumulate gradually over time, making them difficult to recognize until they have reached crisis levels. The progression from educational viewing to compulsive consumption to paranoid thinking happened so slowly that Rachel did not realize how dramatically her mental state was deteriorating. This gradual progression makes true crime obsession particularly dangerous because individuals may not seek help until serious damage has already occurred. The role of online communities in amplifying the negative effects of true crime consumption cannot be overstated. Rachel's participation in amateur investigation forums created an echo chamber where paranoid thinking was reinforced and validated rather than challenged. These communities can create a false sense of expertise and encourage people to make accusations and engage in harassment based on speculation rather than evidence. The case of the Reddit Boston Marathon bombing investigation demonstrates how amateur online sleuths can cause real harm to innocent people through false accusations and vigilante behavior. Rachel's case also highlights the importance of understanding the difference between genuine safety education and fear-based entertainment. Effective personal safety education focuses on evidence-based strategies for risk reduction and is grounded in statistical reality rather than sensationalized scenarios. True crime content, by contrast, focuses on extreme and unusual cases that are not representative of typical criminal activity and can create inflated perceptions of danger that lead to unnecessary restrictions on normal activities. The psychological vulnerability factors that made Rachel susceptible to true crime obsession are present in many people, particularly young women living independently for the first time. The desire to feel prepared for potential dangers is natural and healthy, but true crime content exploits this desire by presenting extreme scenarios as common occurrences. Understanding these vulnerability factors can help people recognize when their consumption habits might be becoming problematic. Family members and friends play a crucial role in identifying and addressing problematic true crime consumption before it reaches crisis levels. The warning signs include increased anxiety about routine activities, social withdrawal, paranoid interpretation of neutral events, excessive discussion of criminal cases, and changes in sleep patterns or daily routines. Early intervention can prevent the psychological damage from becoming severe and reduce the likelihood of serious real-world consequences. The media literacy implications of Rachel's case extend beyond true crime content to include all forms of entertainment that exploit real human suffering or present distorted representations of reality. Developing critical thinking skills about media consumption, understanding the motivations behind content creation, and recognizing the psychological effects of different types of entertainment are essential life skills in the digital age. Rachel's recovery process demonstrates that the psychological damage caused by excessive true crime consumption can be reversed through appropriate treatment and lifestyle changes. However, recovery requires complete elimination of problematic content, professional therapeutic intervention, and significant effort to rebuild healthy thought patterns and social relationships. The recovery process can be lengthy and challenging, making prevention far preferable to treatment. The broader societal implications of widespread true crime obsession include the potential for increased fear and paranoia in communities, reduced trust between neighbors and strangers, and the normalization of surveillance and vigilante behavior. When large numbers of people consume content that presents extreme criminal cases as representative of normal human behavior, it can erode social cohesion and create unnecessary barriers to community engagement and mutual support. The ethical questions raised by the true crime industry deserve serious consideration from both content creators and consumers. The exploitation of victims suffering for entertainment purposes raises fundamental questions about respect for human dignity and the responsibility that media companies have to their audiences. Consumers of true crime content should consider whether their viewing habits are contributing to the exploitation of real people who have already suffered tremendously. Rachel's experience ultimately provides a cautionary tale about the hidden dangers of seemingly innocent entertainment choices. Her case demonstrates that the psychological effects of media consumption can be far more powerful and long-lasting than most people realize. The gradual progression from educational interest to compulsive obsession to paranoid thinking shows how easily entertainment can become a trap that damages mental health and quality of life. The most important takeaway from Rachel's journey is the need for conscious, intentional choices about media consumption. Rather than passively consuming whatever content algorithms recommend or whatever happens to be popular, people need to actively consider the psychological effects of their entertainment choices and maintain awareness of how different types of content affect their mental state, worldview, and behavior. For those who choose to consume true crime content, Rachel's case suggests the importance of strict limitations on consumption frequency and duration, regular evaluation of psychological effects, and immediate discontinuation if any signs of increased anxiety, paranoia, or social withdrawal develop. The goal should be maintaining the ability to distinguish between entertainment and reality while preserving the capacity for normal social interaction and appropriate risk assessment. Rachel's recovery and her current advocacy for awareness about the psychological dangers of true crime consumption provide hope that individuals can reclaim their mental health and quality of life even after falling into the trap of media-induced anxiety and paranoia. Her willingness to share her experience serves as a warning to others and demonstrates the possibility of rebuilding a life based on accurate perception of reality rather than fear-based entertainment consumption. The lessons learned from Rachel's experience extend far beyond true crime content to include all forms of media that exploit fear, present distorted representations of reality, or encourage compulsive consumption patterns. In an age of unlimited access to disturbing content, developing the skills to protect mental health while making conscious entertainment choices has become an essential component of overall wellness and psychological resilience. If you found this case as shocking as we did, make sure to subscribe to Criminal Mind Cortex for more incredible true crime investigations that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the psychological effects of the content we consume every day. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest investigations into the most mind-bending cases from around the world, because understanding these psychological traps might just protect you or someone you love from falling into the same dangerous patterns that nearly destroyed Rachel's life completely.